On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic departed from Southampton on her maiden voyage, a journey that would end in tragedy just 5 days later. In the early hours of April 15th, the great ship vanished beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Over 1,500 lives were lost, but some survived. These are their stories. Academy of Shorts presents Survivors of the Titanic Disaster. Noël Leslie, the Countess of Rothes, boarded the Titanic as a first-class passenger. Known for her grace and quiet strength, she showed remarkable courage during the disaster. When the ship struck the iceberg, she helped other women into lifeboats. And when Lifeboat 8 was lowered, she took the tiller and helped row through the freezing night. A crewman later called her more of a man than any I've known. She survived the sinking and returned to England, where she quietly continued her charitable work for decades. The Countess never sought fame for what she did, but those who shared her lifeboat never forgot her strength. Michel and Edmond Navratil were just 4 and 2 years old when they boarded the Titanic, traveling under false names with their father, who had taken them without their mother's knowledge. When the ship began to sink, their father placed them into Lifeboat D, the last to leave, and stayed behind. He did not survive. For days, no one knew who the children were. They spoke only French and became known to the world as the Titanic Orphans. After a photo of them was published, their mother in France recognized her sons and was reunited with them. Though too young to remember much, Michel would later say the tragedy shaped him forever, a story of loss, mystery, and the quiet resilience of 2 little boys adrift in history. Frederick Fleet was just 24 when he took his post as a lookout on the Titanic. On the night of April 14, 1912, from the crow's nest, he spotted the iceberg and rang the warning bell 3 times. His message reached the bridge, but it was too late. The collision happened less than a minute later. Fleet survived the sinking in Lifeboat 6, but the moment he raised the alarm would follow him the rest of his life. He testified in both inquiries, quietly carrying the burden of having seen the disaster before it struck. He lived in near obscurity, haunted by memory. He rang the bell, but the ship didn't turn. J. Bruce Ismay was the chairman of the White Star Line, the man behind the Titanic's design and ambition. On its maiden voyage, he walked the decks with pride, surrounded by luxury and praise. But when the iceberg struck and the great ship began to die, that pride dissolved into silence. Ismay helped load lifeboats, and then stepped into one himself. He survived, while so many others were left behind. The newspapers called him a coward. The public turned his name into a symbol of shame. He never defended himself, he never spoke of that night again. For the rest of his life, he lived in quiet exile, haunted, reclusive and marked. He had escaped the sea, but not the judgment of history. He survived the sinking of the Titanic, but never truly returned. Harold Bride was just 22 years old when he boarded the Titanic, the junior wireless operator responsible for messages between ship and shore. He and Jack Phillips worked around the clock. When Titanic struck the iceberg, Bride stayed at his post. As chaos grew above, he sent out the ship's SOS, again and again, until the lights flickered and the water reached the cabin. He escaped through a broken window, his feet were crushed, but he survived the freezing night on an overturned lifeboat. Bride later testified in both inquiries, but unlike others, he never sought attention. He returned to sea, served in World War I, and lived a quiet life far from the public eye. For the rest of his years, he said little, but he had spoken when it mattered most. He was the last voice of the Titanic. Frederick Ray was a steward aboard the RMS Titanic. A quiet man with strong hands, he served in second class, ensuring passengers were cared for, fed, and seen. When the iceberg struck, Ray helped load lifeboats amid the chaos. He followed orders, stayed calm, and watched as the great ship began to vanish beneath him. He survived the sinking, rescued from one of the last lifeboats. But like many who lived, he carried the silence of that night for the rest of his life. Ray returned to sea, but the Titanic never left him. He didn't speak often of what happened. And yet, in every glance, every breath, you can see the weight of memory. Stuart Collett was a 27-year-old baker from England, traveling aboard Titanic as a third-class passenger. He was headed for a new life in America, filled with hope like so many others below decks. When the ship struck the iceberg, Collett acted quickly. He found his way to the upper deck and managed to board Lifeboat 9, one of the few launched with men aboard from third class. Cold, shaken and silent, he watched from the lifeboat as the great ship slipped into the dark. He survived the night and was rescued by the Carpathia. But survival came with a cost. Collett returned to England, choosing a life of quiet work and reflection. He spoke rarely of the disaster, but behind his eyes, it never left him. Charles Lightoller was Titanic's second officer, the highest-ranking crew member to survive the disaster. On the night of April 14, 1912, he led with discipline and resolve. He oversaw the loading of lifeboats, enforced the women and children first order, and stayed on board until the bitter end. When the ship plunged beneath the Atlantic, he was dragged under with it, but surfaced near an overturned collapsible boat, where he clung through the freezing night alongside dozens of others. But his story didn't end there. Lightoller returned to the sea in World War I. In 1940, at the age of 66, he volunteered his small boat to help evacuate Allied troops from Dunkirk. He lived a life of duty, courage, and quiet defiance, a sailor who answered every call and never backed away. Violet Jessop was a stewardess aboard the Titanic, 24 years old, calm under pressure, and no stranger to the sea. When the ship struck the iceberg, she helped women and children to lifeboats, then was ordered into Lifeboat 16 to set an example of composure. She watched Titanic vanish into the dark Atlantic, holding a baby handed to her by a panicked passenger. Unbelievably, this wasn't her only brush with disaster. She had been aboard Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, when it collided with a warship. And in 1916, she was serving as a nurse on the Britannic when it struck a mine and sank. She jumped from the ship and survived once again. Through 3 maritime catastrophes, Violet Jessop never abandoned her post and never let fear dictate her fate. She boarded the Titanic as Margaret Brown, but history would remember her as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Born in Missouri in 1867, she rose from modest beginnings to a life of wealth and activism. When Titanic struck the iceberg, she didn't panic, she acted. Molly helped load lifeboats, urged others to row, and famously tried to return to look for survivors. Her courage didn't end there. On the Carpathia, she organized aid for the grieving and destitute, even challenging crew and officials to do more. Brown later became a fierce advocate for women's rights, education, and workers. She ran for US Senate before women even had the vote. Molly Brown didn't just survive Titanic, she fought to lift others with her. That's why her legacy still resonates today. Thank you for watching. We hope you found this journey through Titanic's survivors moving and memorable. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned. More stories from history are on the way, right here on Academy of Shorts.